When you know that you're about to embark on a long road trip to 2,000 kilometers or so for 2 or 3 days worth of driving, what you want is a really good audiobook. And for the drive to Cairns, I selected The Last Viking by Don Hollway, narrated by Mark Meadows. The narrator did a fabulous job with it, by the way. I was just come from a weekend doing the Viking solstice at Lismore. I was definitely in the mood for some Viking history, and this was perfect. It is so well written. I can't emphasize how well it is done. It draws on a lot of sources, including a couple I hadn't heard of. I had heard of Snorri Snorrisson. I've read other accounts of Harald Hardrada in the past. Harald Sigurdsson, as he started off his life as being. A lot of the Byzantium ones I've read for myself, and I've read other accounts of Hardrada. There were a couple of sources that the author mentions that I wasn't really aware of. One of them was the Morkinskinna, he called them. Apparently there are two Iceland documents. One is named the Mouldy Parchment. I hadn't heard of them, and I haven't been able to find any more references. In that way, listening to an audiobook fell down. I didn't have any references at the back. I would definitely like to see the novel and see some of these references. The author does something really quite magnificent. We know a lot about Hardrada. He's been written about quite extensively because we do have so many different sources about him. And because of 1066, the Battle of Hastings, which created England as we know it, when Hardrada and his English collaborator Tostig were defeated on Stamford Bridge. It's noted, any historian who's into English or European history will know about that. Whether that makes Hardrada the last Viking or not is debatable, but it's a good title for a book. So one of the things the author does incredibly well is he creates a very nuanced, balanced view of Hardrada because he uses so many different sources and he weaves them together. And he somehow manages to do something that very few history writers can do. He manages to mention where his sources are through the narrative, define or evaluate how reliable they are as part of the narrative, and still manage to combine them into a really exciting, absolutely gripping at times narrative. History writers struggle with this. Many of them can create a gripping narrative that's based on actual historic documents, but they don't seem to be able to incorporate into the text for the benefit of people like me who want to know how much of this is real and how much is this invented. Don Hollway, if I was wearing a hat, I'd be taking it off. He does a fabulous job of it. And it's gripping. It's absolutely fascinating. And at least the first part and the end bits of it are very fast moving. The way he manages to point out the errors and contradictions of the sources and how accurate they might be is phenomenal, considering what an exciting story it is. Anyway, so I really liked the first part. That drew very heavily on Snorri Snorrisson's tales. And the second part, in that part, it starts off at Stamford Bridge with the defeat of Hardrada, which is right at the end of his lifetime. But then it pops way back in time when Hardrada is a boy of, 14 or 15, and he's going into battle with his older brother Olaf in Norway to regain the kingdom that Olaf lost. Now, the way that's described is different to how I've seen it described in the past. Hollway makes the point that the reason Olaf didn't have that kingdom anymore was he hadn't done terribly good at ruling. And the reason that he lost that particular battle is because virtually everyone, from the merest landholder to the highest ruler in Norway, wanted no part of him ever again. He was arrayed against virtually the whole country. And so he died. He died on the battlefield. He died as a Christian. And he turned into a saint. Now, how someone who was despised by a whole country turns into a saint is rather Christian, I've got to say. His point about that battle was that everyone who served under him had to be a Christian, so any mercenaries or any pagans along the line, if they wanted to fight for him, and he was offering a lot of money, so a lot of them did want to fight for him, they all had to convert to Christianity, and many of them did. That came down to part of why he wasn't popular. He wasn't the first Christian king in the Northlands, I believe, but he was one of the ones who went for forced conversions. And a lot of people didn't really like that. Can't blame them. Anyway, so Olaf was defeated in the battle. The myth of Saint Olaf starts there. But Hardrada, or Harald Sigurdsson, at that stage is concealed in the woods. I've heard that story before. He escapes across the border into what's now Sweden, where he's given refuge by a kinsman, because kin was very strong in those particular groups. There wasn't really very much for him in Sweden. He had no chance of going back to Norway. He couldn't go back to his family, and he ended up travelling through what is now Russia to Ladoga, and then down the river to yet more kinsmen in Kiev. From there, he eventually makes his way into Byzantium and serves in Constantinople. He becomes part of the Varangian Guard, and that's a part that most other books that I've read before concentrate on quite heavily. In this narrative, I thought the early part was excellent. Part 2, from the point when Harald Sigurdsson becomes a member of the Varangian Guard, it started drawing, well, it still drew partly on Icelandic tales and Northland tales. It drew very heavily on Byzantium. And so at that point it started concentrating more on Byzantium intrigue and Constantinople politics, and that describes how Hardrada got so much battle experience, and that is very interesting. Don't get me wrong, I like reading about Byzantium, but because of the sources that are available that were being used, Harald isn't actually mentioned so much. There's a lot of speculation that the author has to enter into. For someone who is interested in specifically in Vikings and the Northlands, that might lag a fair bit. For someone who's interested specifically in Constantinople and has read a bit, a lot of it will sound familiar, but you always have new slants and new things that he says, so that's actually quite an excellent part. Now the third part tells us about Harald eventually left Byzantium, travelled up, became king of Norway, partly through marrying a daughter of Kiev. His relationship with his nephew King Magnus, with whom he had also been in Kiev before Magnus had been retrieved by people to be a more compliant king of Norway than they thought that Hardrada would be. And in fact, Magnus had precedence. He was the son of King of Olaf rather than his brother. Now, after he becomes king in Norway, that's when Harald Hardrada earns his title of Hardrada, which means apparently, so I'm told, hard ruler. He doesn't sound like a nice guy, and he doesn't sound like a happy guy, and he ruled Norway hard. Did he ever? He had perpetual wars with Sven of Denmark, and really anyone else, including most of his own citizens. He elevated people only to war against them. This dude was harsh. And the picture emerges of this really hard, bitter man who knows nothing but warfare, but doesn't really know how to rule, and he doesn't know how to relate to people. So his nephew Magnus, as a king, was beloved because he gave to his people and he shared with them. Hardrada was under the thumb or nothing. He drives loyal-ish subjects at least to revolt, and a lot of the things that are recorded about him sound intensely harsh, and that many of these records come from his own people, some including his bard. So yes, then again we get into part 4, which tells once again from the end of the tale, this Battle of Stamford Bridge, and that is the end of his life, and it's very, very vivid. Overall, it's a great book. The battles are magnificent. This book felt more epic than Wheel of Time. Robert Jordan can go whistle in the wind compared to this book. This is epicness. This is battles. This is love. This is far, far stronger stuff than most fantasy series. It's well researched. It's spectacular. It's historically accurate. It's all pulled together into this marvelous story. This may well be the best book that I've read all year, but it's heavy to read. There's a lot of it. Harald Sigurdsson had a life that is the stuff of legends, and we actually know a fair bit about him. That's the thing that makes this book really so magnificent, is that we do have so many sources talking about him, whereas I'm sure there's plenty of other people in his own lifetime that had amazing stories, but we don't know them. Like Olaf, who became Saint Olaf, who people are praying to, is also mentioned. So you've got all these different takes on the life and the story. The Kievan, yes. The story of how he travels down the great rivers of Russia to Constantinople to take service with the Roman Empire, that was intensely well told. And again, it draws on so many different sources. The Perchaks who were on the river. Yeah, raving a bit here, aren't I? It's a very meaty book. I think this is a book that you could read over and over again for many years and still find more to get out of it. If you are into Norse mythology, Vikings, Byzantium, history, this will be for you. If you like epic stories and you're starting to get that slightly blah feeling that you get. I've recently read several series of epic fantasy, and I've been reading them for decades. And when I start an epic fantasy these days, it's a bit of a sigh as you adjust to the world, whichever strange names have been invented, the geography. All of this has been invented for your pleasure. But I've read an awful lot of them, and they tend to meld into one. This story has all of that, but it's actual history, so it's of some benefit to remember it. And it is far, far more exciting than many of the ones I've read. So yeah, epic fantasy readers, read this instead, and then go back to epic fantasy. There's plenty there. Magic swords? No. Real swords? Holy shit. You wouldn't believe how many swords. The battles in the Mediterranean had an extra spark of interest for me, because at one point Constantinople is warring with are they Muslims? Oh, Sicily. Anyway, so we're down in Sicily at the bottom of Italy, and that's been invaded from the general Africa direction. Constantinople believes that it belongs to them. They want it back, so they keep sending wave after wave of warriors there. They're choosing their battle commanders poorly, so battle commander after battle commander does a bad job. And that was fascinating. The story of how the commanders are chosen and how they were called epic. Just saying, epic. But the other interesting thing about it is that it talks about the Normans that were there. And I've forgotten their name, I should be ashamed of it. But there's a series called Mercenary somewhere on that bookshelf, which I'll review one day, about how basically we know that Vikings went down and settled around about what's France now. There was one particular one who sent 5 of his sons down into Italy, and they became the Norman invaders. That's another truly epic story, and they appear in this book. So if you've been reading much about the Normans in Italy, or Constantinople, or Stamford Bridge and English history, any of these things will keep bringing in lots of things that you know which support the story. Truly epic. Did I mention epic? Definitely for people who've got my interest. Total hats off to Don Hollway for producing such a magnificently researched. The research in this is spectacular. Great book.